But let's talk about anti-Israel hysteria on the left and how it's today being shown up by a report to our government that should be ashamed of itself. In April, an Australian aid worker, Zomi Frankham, was tragically killed in Gaza in a drone strike by Israel's army, the IDF. A drone strike on her aid convoy. Now, it was clearly a mistake. I mentioned it at the time. And Israel fired 2 officers responsible who thought the convoy was of Hamas terrorists. But this same Green senator, Mehreen Faruqi, claimed Israel had actually deliberately targeted aid workers and called it murder. The Prime Minister didn't go quite that far, but still too far, accusing Israel of breaking humanitarian law, saying Israel's explanations weren't good enough. He then sent former Defence Force Chief Mark Binskin to Israel to investigate all this, as if Israel was covering up those wicked Israelis. But guess what? Binskin has now reportedly backed most of Israel's explanation, which was pretty self-evident at the time, concluding it was indeed a terrible mistake made in the fog of war. But you've got to ask why there is always this presumption by many on the left, including unions, that Israel is murderous, even likely to target aid workers. Well, Peter Lerner, he's visiting Australia to do something about this. He's a top official of Histadrut, Israel's biggest, the most influential trade union and social movement. He served in Israel's defence forces for 25 years and came back as a reservist to be an IDF spokesman for the first month of this war. We've interviewed him on the show before. Peter Lerner, good to see you again. The left in Australia, in fact around the world, but the left here, including Labor, including unions, they're getting very hostile to Israel, very pro-Palestinian. It's almost like a tribal thing, really. Why do you think that is?
I think, first of all, there's a huge challenge in addressing the connections between Al Jazeera and TikTok. And when you put 2 of those things together, you get a toxic report blown out of proportion and zoomed in on the nature of war. And it is definitely, there are tragedies throughout this war, but it creates and connects people to their most deepest emotions when they see tragic images. Unfortunately, they have a short memory. It was indeed Hamas that started the war, and it is Hamas that is paying dearly for the bad, poor decisions that they decided to attack Israel. And when I would say politicians around the world can't realize that when our democracy is under threat, and indeed our democracy in Israel is under threat from external players such as Hamas or Hezbollah and Iran, then we need to rally around those that are under threat.
I don't know whether you followed the Australian media at all, Peter Lerner, but you know, when there was that clearly accidental IDF attack on an aid convoy killing an Australian, Zomi Frankham, there were allegations from the Greens, for instance. The implication was murder, and our own government said, oh, you know, Israel's got hard questions to answer. Now there's a report by to the government saying, well, actually, we've had a look and, you know, it does seem to be an accident. I mean, seriously, how can you deal with that sort of aggression and hostility?
So I think what Israel did is we opened our arms and our doors and shared our information and allowed the investigation to come to the conclusion that we came to, that it was a tragedy in a state of war, and that like-minded militaries like the Australian Air Force conduct similar operations, and that's why I understand that there is a frustration, and I think that what Israel did was very irregular. I can't imagine Australia opening the doors to an Israeli inquiry of a former chief of staff. But we understand the importance, we understand, and we're also sensitive towards the loss of civilian lives. And definitely these humanitarian workers don't need to pay the price of war, and we need to do better in order to prevent that from happening.
I heard your interview with the ABC's Patricia Karvelis, who has, showed the antagonism of the left, and like many saying, well, look, in this war, the casualties are disproportionate. I don't quite get that. Is there some sort of rule that I've missed that if Hamas starts a war by killing 1,200 Israelis, that in that war, Israel can only inflict as many casualties as it itself suffers? So, you know, you can't keep fighting if suddenly there are more Palestinians dead than Israelis. Is that your understanding, this idea of proportionality?
No, of course not. Proportionality weighs not on numbers, but on what the military advantage of the suspected target and its civilian effect that it will cause, and how to weigh those up based on what the commanders knew at the time and the precautions that were taken in order to limit the civilian casualties and civilian impact. I would argue that Israel conducts its military affairs based on on the principles and concepts of the laws of armed conflict, including proportionality and distinguishing between civilians and non-combatant in a way which goes beyond what most Western militaries do. You know, we send text messages, we evacuate people from specific areas by announcing to the specific population, this is where we're going, with a map that we designed specifically for them. And in effect, what we're doing by distributing this type of information is announcing to Hamas, this is where we're going to mobilize to. So they have enough time to set their booby traps, to prepare their ambushes, to prepare their anti-tank guided missile attacks. So I would say we do a lot more than most militaries. I would say that it's based on colleagues from Western militaries, from Sandhurst to West Point, that have told me, Peter, you are setting a standard that most militaries can't live up to in the realm of warfare. That is a fact. And you know, when you talk about proportionality, it's trying to weigh on the underlying fact that Israel is disproportionate. And I would say absolutely not. Israel is operating in a proportionate manner based on the realities of the ground and the very stark reality that Hamas has, over the last 17 years, built a fortified position in every location, civilian location, within the Gaza Strip, jeopardizing the civilians intentionally. You see, Andrew, what they have done as a strategy is use civilian facilities like hospitals, like mosques, like schools, like the UN facilities, UNRWA facilities, under the banners of the flags of the United Nations, as their Iron Dome, as a protective system to endure and try and survive this war. I think there's a very clear understanding that, and all decent people understand this, for there to be any sort of peace in this region, in the region in Israel and with the Palestinians, Hamas have to go.
Absolutely right. And let us not forget that some of those facilities built with UN handouts that were pilfered, that's Australian money as well, Australian government money. Peter Lerner, I hope you get your message through here. Good luck.
Thank you very much.